For our listeners, this is a content warning. Throughout this podcast, we touch on subjects related to trauma, misogyny, racism and medical racism, sexual misconduct, residential schools, as well as many aspects of death and dying. Should you need them, there is a list of resources in our show notes. Most importantly, as you listen, take a break when you need to, and please take care of yourselves. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast is produced and recorded across the land known as Canada. These traditional and treaty territories are full of rich Indigenous histories, home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and MAiD peoples. We embrace the opportunity to share this story in a respectful, inclusive, and culturally appropriate way.
I'm Danielle Wilson-Brown. This podcast is about my mom, Marion Brown. She is a visionary, perpetual student, the biggest nerd, and adventure seeker. She is in a one-life stand with my dad, Fred. She is a mother of 3 and new grandmother of 2 beautiful grandbabies. She is a TV and film producer, former musician, family therapist, governance consultant, and soon-to-be ex-council member of Githatha Nation in BC. Oh, and by the way, she also has pulmonary hypertension. There is no cure, and it will take her life. And so, we're going to share our story and this end-of-life journey with you. I hope you'll join me, Danielle Wilson-Brown, my mom, and some special guests as we begin to discuss death, dying, and above all, living. Welcome to Before I Go. How are you doing, Mom?
You know, we listened to a podcast while we went on this long road trip this past week. And they spoke to Gabor Mate and said that when they asked him the question, "How are you?" he gave this long, drawn-out answer. And I realized that's actually what I need to do, is acknowledge all parts of myself. So at this point, I'm good. I'm feeling at peace. But knowing that in the past week, I have just felt a lot of different emotions. I've ended my short-lived political career as an elected council member for my nation, starting off on a whole different chapter of my life that I wasn't necessarily counting on getting. So right now, I'm at peace. How are you, Danny?
I'm the same. I feel like it's been a roller coaster of emotions the past week. Like you right now, I am grateful. I am grateful to be here, to have this conversation, to learn. You know, we've said in other episodes, we are forever students. So I'm always open to hearing and learning from a different perspective, and considering how personal this topic is. While I'm okay, I think the tears are going to be kind of easy today. Today, we're talking about MAiD with a non-Indigenous medical professional who also has experience in the legal system. I want to welcome Dr. Adam Sandell. I want to thank you so much for being here. I first heard about you when we were looking through the Dying with Dignity website, and I saw that you and another nurse practitioner were hosting a webinar. I attended your webinar and I heard a lot of important information. I'm hoping that you can introduce yourself, tell me where you're calling from, and how are you today?
My name's Adam Sandell. Please do call me Adam. I'm joining today from my home, which is on the unceded, ancestral, and stolen territories of the Penelakut tribe, and have the honor of my career to spend part of each month living and working with and for the Healthsec Nation in BC's Central Coast in Bella Bella as a GP and emergency room doctor at the hospital located on that reserve. One of very few hospitals, as I understand it, in Canada located on a reserve. I also work part-time as someone who carries out assessments for medical assistance in dying in BC, and sometimes I provide medical assistance in dying to people who are suffering intolerably. I moved to Canada about 5 years ago from the UK, where, as you can hear, I grew up and spent most of my life to date in my career.
So you mentioned that you moved from the UK to northern BC, but how did you end up in Bella Bella?
It's a great question, and there's not a super easy answer to that. I guess, for much of my life, I've known that at some point I wanted to work in another part of the world and experience another culture. And then I fell in love with Canada, which answered the question of where. And then while looking at work opportunities here, I fell in love with a Canadian. So that made it all easier because I had someone to move to as well as somewhere to move to. And I discovered, the kind of work that I now do doesn't exist in many parts of the world. In high resource countries like Canada, there are not many places where people are doing the kind of remote medicine, rural medicine in remote communities. That is the norm in many Canadian communities, where your scope of practice, the range of stuff that you're doing, is wider than I think almost any doctor in the world, at least in high income countries, has done since kind of the 1950s. It is vastly more rewarding. So I then discovered the opportunity to work not quite in northern BC, but in the Central Coast, in Bella Bella, at this hospital that's located on a reserve, and working with and for the Heiltsuk Nation. And that just I knew that would be an extraordinary experience, and I was nervous about it. And I had some mentorship from an Indigenous physician who has since become a friend, because I was worried about whether I was the right person to do that kind of work. And it's been the best career decision I have ever made in my life.
I want to hear about what was your driving force to go into medicine and eventually help with the MAiD program.
One of my earlier memories was when I was quite a little boy, and I think this would have been in the late 1970s, sitting next to my father, watching the news on TV, and at too young an age to know a lot about what goes on in the world. And there was a story which I think was about some kind of state awfulness going on behind what was then the Iron Curtain in the totalitarian regimes of the Soviet Union and the other Eastern Bloc countries. And I don't remember what it was about, but it was something awful that people in power were doing to people who didn't have power. I remember asking my father what was going on, and struggling to get my head around the idea that people were doing whatever the awful thing was that they were doing to each other, because they're people, and how could you do awful things to other people? And I think I kind of come from the that position that people sometimes describe as, if you're not part of the solution, then you're part of the problem. And I've tried to use my work in all of the ways that I can think of to try and be more a part of the solution than a part of the problem. And that's, I guess that's the driving force between what I do. Medical assistance in dying seems to me just obviously something that we, as decent human beings who have the tools to relieve suffering in certain circumstances, ought to be able to offer to each other. And if that's the case, then it seems important that there are people who are willing to do it. I just feel a little bit of a responsibility to ensure that it is available to people who need it in extreme conditions.
The hospital environment can be so traumatizing. And so the idea of using MAiD and allowing for a peaceful transition seems loving, seems humane. Because you brought up the horrible things we can do to each other. And to be honest, as an Indigenous person in Canada, that's all we've heard. One of the common threads through a lot of these stories is I talk about my mother who passed away. She died of ovarian cancer. By the time she was diagnosed, she was stage 4. But she had gone through the Indian hospitals. I don't know if you know about the atrocities that happened there. Yeah. And she had gone through residential school and lived through a very racist society. And yet still was a beautiful human being that didn't allow that to change who she was. And so I think it's important that we have those conversations around the inhumanity that we have and being able to make those choices of choosing peace at the end of your life. But I appreciate people like you becoming a doctor with that you lead with your heart. And that was part of what we had done as a council member for my nation, was constantly remind ourselves as leaders to lead with our heart. And if you do that, you're doing the right thing.
I would pay huge tribute. I have huge respect, Marion, to you for what you are doing, because these are not easy conversations to have. This is, I can imagine, not an easy time in your life. And I think that talking about MAiD from an Indigenous perspective is a really complicated thing, because as you touch on when you talk about Indian hospitals and residential schools, what my Indigenous patients are bringing to them when I bringing to the the clinic in which I see them and the hospital in which I see them and care for them is often a recent history of lives not having been adequately cared for by people who look and sound like me.
A very common term in Indigenous communities is generational trauma. But how does that pop up? What does that look like? Well, it looks like trauma before you even get to the hospital, because so many Indigenous people don't even trust the medical system to get checked out, to get medical treatment. Because that generational trauma looks like, is this person going to hurt me? Does this person have stereotypes or beliefs or, something that tells them, these doctors, nurses, whoever is in this facility, saying, do they even see me as human? And so it starts even before we go to the doctor's office. It starts before we even go to the hospital, and I really appreciate just the allyship that you represent. But we're just kind of wondering, what's been your experience with the MAiD program and being in an Indigenous community?
I mean, in a way, this is a question I'd love to turn back on you and learn from you about, because the experience of most people involved in medical assistance in dying in Canada, as I understand it, is that MAiD almost never or very rarely is brought up by Indigenous people. And I'm also aware of, although certainly don't claim any expertise, of concerns about MAiD that have been raised by advocates for Indigenous people. And that, there is this kind of terrible kind of historical optics of white doctors having Indigenous people die under their care. So I've never been asked for MAiD by an Indigenous patient in my relatively short time in Canada. It's available to any Canadian who meets the eligibility criteria, and I believe very strongly that it should be available to those who meet the eligibility criteria. But the short answer to your question of kind of my experience of MAiD in an Indigenous community is the only people to whom I've provided MAiD in the Indigenous community in which I work are settlers who live off the reserve, and it's almost never come up in conversation with Indigenous patients. And if it's okay to kind of turn the question around, I'd love to hear your perspectives of how it feels as though it's landing with your community and even with your family members. How are people integrating this into Indigenous culture and values that they already hold?
Well, I tend to think the conversation isn't even being started. Doctors are having trouble giving the option because of, given the racist history of the medical system in Canada. I've said it before, I'll say it again. We cannot fix what we don't acknowledge. We need to acknowledge the painful racist history in Canada. The Indian hospitals were atrocious places. Both my parents had gone. And what I find, especially as a patient advocate, is explaining to them what my mother had lived through, just so that they can shift their perspective just a little bit in how they treated her. And she was, I think, 5 years old when she went into Miller Bay Hospital outside of Prince Rupert. She didn't speak English. Somalia was her first language, so she learned to speak English there. And at one point, one of the kids broke a window in the kids' ward, and nobody would fess up as to who did it. So they put them all in a body cast from her chest down to her ankles, and then there was the bar between her knees. Given that she was 5 years old, she didn't know how long she was in this body cast, just long enough to know that it hurt, that she outgrew it. And that was typical treatment. So understanding why our people don't trust the medical system is important. And I think that's a huge part of when you're training to be doctors in Canada. Let's learn about that. Not just an hour or two. Let's actually learn about what happened there. I tell people Joseph Mengele would have been proud of the shit that happened there. My dad was also in the same hospital, not at the same time as my mom. There was a little boy that nobody came to visit. This little boy, you don't know why, but they started taking bones out. They took his clavicle out. They took his shoulder blade out. They started taking ribs out. My dad said by the time they were done with this poor boy, his arm was just hanging and he couldn't do anything with it. And why? Was this a medical experiment? You just want to cry for that little boy.
One of the things I hear from people sometimes, kind of between the lines, is, okay, we get it that Indian hospitals and residential schools and so much more was awful and people are traumatized. But why do they have to keep on talking about it? And the more time that I spend working where I work with Indigenous people, the more I realize that the reason you have to keep on talking about it is because it permeates every bit of your life experience after that in ways that, because I've not had that experience, because I'm not a victim of intergenerational trauma, I'm never really going to be able to understand. And it's there always. I went to see a doctor yesterday myself, and I went in confident, knowing that this was likely to be a relationship between equals, and that I was going to be safe, and that I'd be able to speak up for myself and be heard. And I know that that's simply not the case for a lot of my Indigenous patients. when medical students and residents coming to our community ask me, what do I need to do to be culturally sensitive? What have you most learned about getting this right? My answer often is you need to listen. People, if you earn people's trust, people are going to want to tell you things, and you may not appreciate at the time why it matters, or why this long story is important, but they're telling it you because it is important, and at some point you're going to realize why it is important.
For many of them, it's the first time they're using their voice. Like I said, my father's turning 90 this year and has only told us that he was sexually abused on the very first day he went into the hospital. And he was in there for years. That trauma was passed on to me. That trauma was passed on to my daughter. And we're going to talk about it. And we are going to make people sit in that uncomfortableness, because that's only a tiny, tiny bit of what they had to suffer. There's no quick fix. There's no, okay, you're healed now. You don't have intergenerational trauma anymore. This country has to understand the horrible, horrible things that happened to Indigenous people, the genocide. The whole reason we started this podcast is so we can open up this conversation. And we're going to acknowledge the things as they come up. It hurts to talk about my parents' traumas and pains that I feel like when I was younger, I almost judged them for it. And yeah, why are you still talking about that? Why don't you trust white people? Why don't you go to the doctor when you're not feeling well? Because if you have the privilege, and I've had the privilege that my parents didn't have, I got to become a medical advocate for my mother, for my sister, for many family members. And I made sure as hell that they were treated well.
I'm Danielle Wilson Brown, and this is Before I Go, a podcast where my mom, Marion Brown, and I have some of the most profound conversations of our lives about her end-of-life journey.
That question you brought up about why can't we have this conversation with Indigenous people? And I wanted to ask you what that looked like. So if I come to you and say, Adam, I want to do this, let's have that conversation.
You want me to assess you for MAiD right now?
Yeah.
Well, let me talk through some of the things I'd go through and do if I really were assessing you for medical assistance in dying. And I guess the first and the biggest question is, how did you reach this decision? Why are we having this conversation?
Because I have a condition that can't be cured, that's progressive, that will eventually take my life, that has stripped away so much of my life already, that it's just going to get worse. And that I had watched my sister pass from the same condition. She went to her grave just praying for a lung transplant, which was the only treatment. It's not a cure, it's a treatment that gives you at best another 5 years with the limitations of what a transplant comes with. So that's why I decided.
And as things deteriorate for you, and as you become more symptomatic, you should have available to you the very best of medical care, including palliative care, so including measures to relieve any symptoms that you may be experiencing. including medications and aids and adaptations and emotional and spiritual support. Tell me why allowing yourself to die naturally with those things available and in place, why you don't want that to happen, why MAiD is a better option for you.
I believe MAiD is a better option because with those medications and everything available, it doesn't necessarily prolong your life. You exist a bit longer. My sister spent months in bed, unable to enjoy anything in her life. While she still had all of the medical, her mental faculties, rather, she wasn't able to get up and be with her children to enjoy the things that she did enjoy. And it was just a long, slow, painful death. But with this condition, that's what happens is the thing with my sister was we were having a conversation with her 20 minutes before she passed away because the body is such an amazing thing that with the very limited function of her heart, it kept her brain alive. And so we were having conversations 20 minutes before she passed away. She even explained the process of seeing the beauty. But this came after the difficult decision of having a DNR. They could have brought her back, but it wasn't going to save her. And in your heart of hearts, if you've ever watched somebody pass away, and if you could get another minute with them, but it'll come at a cost of their continued suffering. More often than not, you choose just to let them go peacefully.
I'd want MAiD myself in that situation, and it's what I'd want for the people that I love. There's no doubt about that. And having been involved in and provided a number of MAiD deaths, it can be a peaceful and beautiful thing in what otherwise would be a drawn out and disagreeable thing. So I understand what you're saying. My next question would be, what is it that you're afraid of if you don't have MAiD?
What am I afraid of? Wow, good question. What am I afraid of if I don't have MAiD? I have to admit, there is something that I became aware of over the past week, and it was the guilt of what I'm putting my family through. Last summer, I had a severe blood infection. And by July 26th, I was given a 50-50 chance of surviving the night. Danielle was out of town, and I FaceTimed with her, and I lied to her, and I told her I was okay. She hasn't forgiven me for that yet. And that's okay. She's allowed to be angry at me. But it's the idea of wanting to spare my children and my family that pain. And I can't. I won't. They will experience it. So by having these conversations, we get to walk through this together. And there's something called anticipatory grief that hits a family hard, that you're waiting for somebody's end of life journey. So what am I afraid of if I don't get MAiD? Is that my quality of life will be so diminished that the trauma will be lingering for my family, for my children, my grandchildren. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for that answer. And you put your finger on something I spend a lot of time thinking about. So one of the questions that I I ask everyone whom I assess for MAiD is, to what extent are you making this decision to protect other people from suffering, or so as not to be a burden on other people? I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that question. So in the UK, where I have spent most of my life, MAiD is not available. And one of the concerns that is sometimes expressed is about people choosing MAiD because they don't want to be a burden to others, to their loved ones. But it seems to me that one of the reasons that we think MAiD should be available is because people ought to be able to control their own destinies and make decisions for themselves. And if you respect people's ability to make decisions for themselves, that means that you don't second guess decisions that they have made when they understand everything that's relevant to that decision and when they're able to make it. And that means, it seems to me necessarily, that if you make a decision that you want to have medical assistance in dying when you're eligible for medical assistance in dying, and the reason is because you choose to spare people you love from the protracted pain of witnessing your suffering or having to care for you when you're really not living much of a life anymore, then you have to respect that decision. That it is not wrong to make a decision to choose MAiD, influenced at least partly by your wish to spare other people from burden or from suffering. That's a decent thing to do, and that if people can make decisions for themselves, that means they can make decisions for themselves.
Can I bring you into this conversation, Danielle? And how does all that make you feel?
We've had these conversations around guilt before, and, I've told you, as heartbreaking as it is, as much weight on my soul as it is, your right to choose how much you're willing to endure when you want that to end. I will always respect that. I will always support you in that. One of the hardest things in life is to see your loved ones suffering and not be able to take away your pain, not be able to take away the suffering. And so even if it breaks my heart to say goodbye when you need to, I will do that. I've said before, MAiD is about love. It's how much I love you and how much you love us. We really went deep with this, didn't we?
Well, if I could give you a hug now, kiddo, I would.
I think I'd be giving you a hug right now if I could.
Bringing it back to Indigenous patients, how do you think we can change how we approach this?
I feel I need to be very cautious about pronouncing on anything to do with Indigenous culture. But I suspect we're all going to be on the same page if I say that it seems to me that change comes about through talking. That we need to talk about stuff. And that's why I have so much respect for the two of you in making this podcast, and why I'm so honored to be a part of it, because my understanding is that this is that your target audience here is primarily Indigenous people in Canada, so that people can learn more about MAiD. And that seems to me to be a huge thing. And maybe you two are going to answer the question that you've just asked me about how we do this. I think there's a recognition within within healthcare that we need to be comfortable talking about MAiD, because a lot of the discomfort is not actually patient discomfort, not actually the people who are needing our services. It's our discomfort at raising MAiD and making people aware that MAiD is an option. And I suspect, because I think I am guilty of this, that may be particularly be a problem for settler healthcare providers working with Indigenous patients, that we're nervous about bringing it up because we don't want our doing that to be construed as doing something culturally insensitive. And cultural sensitivity is difficult. But if we think that we have a responsibility to make people aware of all of their options, then we need to find ways of doing that. And maybe that's another big conversation to have about how healthcare providers can, in a culturally sensitive way, share the MAiD option at appropriate times with their Indigenous patients. And I don't think I've fully answered that question for myself yet. So I suspect I'm getting this wrong sometimes.
I think that that's actually key. There are times in many things that I do that I have more questions than answers. And if you go into it curious, if you go into it knowing that you don't know it all, that just starting the conversation would be enough.
But I'm gonna make myself a little bit vulnerable here. I mean, at least vulnerable to criticism. We were talking a little while ago about the fears that generationally traumatized Indigenous people have about healthcare, and as Danielle put it, and it's given me something to think about, even before they access healthcare. Even before you walk in the door, you're afraid of what's gonna happen to you. And one of my experiences is that manifests, especially amongst family members of elders and of people who are nearing or approaching the end of their lives, or have just a serious condition, as a lot of advocacy. And when I was first working in the Indigenous community in which I work, I found myself thinking, hang on a second, is it not clear that I'm trying to do my best for this person? And I now understand that no, it's not clear, because there have been so many experiences that people have already had that that's not taken for granted. And people do need to do an awful lot of advocacy. I think the anxiety that I have when I'm thinking, here's an Indigenous person for whom MAiD might be an option that they'd want to be aware of. The anxiety that I have is this conversation may get misconstrued. This conversation may get reported back to a family member who's not here, who will be outraged that the settler doctor suggested that he or another settler doctor kill my grandmother or my grandfather or my loved one, my elder. And of course, conversations do get misconstrued, and people do want to advocate for all of the reasons that we've been that we've been talking about. So I think that's a legitimate concern. I think I'm right to worry about that. But I don't think that relieves me of the obligation to ensure that all of my patients are aware of all of the relevant medical options that are open to me. And that is those are two difficult things to reconcile with each other.
This podcast has, the way I've gone into it is that this is a starting point. It's not an answer. It's a platform to ask the right questions. It's a shift in perspective, because The topics that we cover are so heavy, they're so difficult, they're traumatic. But how do we balance that with asking the right questions, to start looking for the answers, and to maintain some kind of hope? Because the people that we've spoken to, it's amazing. Because like we've shared today, we have a lot of trauma. We have a lot of generational trauma. But maintaining that sense of hope that it is going to get better, that's kind of my goal. And talking to people like you has sparked that. And I appreciate that.
I was just about to say, I think you two are giving me that hope. I think what you are doing here is an extraordinarily generous and public-spirited thing to do. And I think this is the beginning of or part of a conversation that in its way makes the world a little bit of a better place. And that's, that's what we all ought to be doing with our lives when we can. And I have huge respect for you for doing that.
I truly appreciate you, Adam. It gives me hope that there are medical practitioners such as yourself who want to hold space for who we are, not as a patient, not as a people, as a person. And I think that's key in this conversation. And you're right. I've learned so much from our elders. I'm just listening. That we won't be spared the pain of the death of a loved one. But this offers that, as Danielle said, it's enveloped in love and peace. And that's my hope.
Well, thank you to the two of you for inviting me on this. This has not been what I expected. It has been much more moving and deeper. And I feel I've learnt an awful lot. And I would love to keep in touch after this, because you're clearly both amazing people. And it's been a real honor to spend this time with you.
Thank you so much for joining us. And it seems to be the way these episodes end is reminding myself and others, and especially our listeners, because these are such heavy topics, that self-care is not a choice. It's mandatory. We need to figure out ways to take care of ourselves.
Yeah, we really do.
So figure out how you're going to show up for yourself today. And just thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Adam. I hope we can stay in touch.
I hope so too. And as the Healthsick people have taught me to say, wala skayasika.
Doyak noon.
Thank you so much for joining us, and take care of yourselves. Self-care is not a choice. It's mandatory. Figure out how to take care of yourself.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope our conversations provided a unique perspective, opened the door to your own discussions, and offer some comfort. If you have any questions or would like to learn more about anything we've discussed or haven't discussed, let us know in the comments. Until next time, at Liwil Doyak Noon. Before I go, gratefully acknowledges the financial support of the Indigenous Screen Office.